All right, my friends, your World War III update. Day 1 of 2 of the NATO summit in Vilnius has been wrapped up. Day 2 of 2 is going to be the most critical of those days, and that is when the inaugural Ukrainian Council is about to convene. For the first time ever, we get a whole day of them brainstorming and deliberating how they're going to extend security guarantees to Ukraine without starting a nuclear war. Now, more often than not, whenever you have a hot-button geopolitical issue like this in the media, the dialectic that is put there for the public to debate over, i.e. whether or not Ukraine will be integrated into NATO, is usually just a smokescreen, okay? The real issue is not whether or not Ukraine will be integrated into NATO, because if you're looking at this from the perspective of the Russians, Ukraine is already a de facto member of NATO. They get the weapons, they get the mercenaries, they get the intelligence, they get the funding, they get everything they pretty much need. And if you are NATO, why on earth would you buy the cow if you're getting the milk for free? There is simply no incentive for NATO to officially ratify Ukraine into the alliance at this point in time, when Ukraine is already volunteering the blood, sweat, and tears of its population. It's already willingly destroyed its country for NATO's interests. So why on earth would NATO take it upon themselves to have to defend this cow? And I'm not calling Ukraine a cow, by the way. It's just an age-old metaphor. Why on earth would NATO elevate the nuclear crisis? Why on earth would they put themselves in the immediate nuclear crosshairs by overstepping the final red line of Russia, which is the formal integration of Ukraine into the NATO alliance? Why on earth would they do that when they're getting everything that they could ask for and more from NATO? And it's important to understand, because there's a lot of people today who are completely misreading what has happened. What they've effectively done, without saying so, is they've made Ukraine a member of NATO. They've gotten rid of what's called the Membership Action Plan. And this is the core hurdle into entering NATO in the first place. So for all intents and purposes, they already are a NATO member, more than NATO members. People are saying that NATO is giving up on Ukraine and they can never walk away from this. This is a hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. NATO must continue now in that direction. The problem is NATO has no army currently to muster that can rival the Russians. At best, they have a combat readiness force of 30,000. Okay, yes, the individual countries have their own militaries, but they don't have the interoperability and the logistics required to immediately go to war with the Russians, who I've said time and time again have an advantage in this situation because they have a very large army that is unified, it's homogeneous, and it is fully interoperable in ways that NATO simply is not. So NATO needs to buy time to build its 300,000 strong combat readiness force. And why on earth would they immediately elevate the nuclear level if they don't have to? Now, it's very critical that Ukraine wins. It's very critical that Russia, from NATO's perspective anyways, is not able to acquire the annexed territories. This is why what they've effectively done here, and if you just really look at the logic of this, and I was watching a Green Greg's video today, and he echoed this same sentiment, or he talked about this in his video. He said that there is no incentive for Russia to stop the war if one of the prerequisites for NATO formally acknowledging Ukraine as a member of its alliance, for them to not be in a state of war. Now understand the logic though. NATO is the one who is pushing Ukraine to get back these territories. Okay, remember back last year when Zelensky and the Russians, they had almost struck a peace deal in Ankara, Turkey, and Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine And all of a sudden, it was on once again. The peace talks effectively failed because they were about to strike a peace deal. So it's NATO who is pushing Ukraine to continue to war with the Russians. Ukraine probably at this point in time, and don't look at Zelensky as being the arbiter of what's going on in Ukraine. This guy is a puppet. He's a former actor. And I do believe, like most politicians, he's acting on a whim. He's acting at the behest of other more powerful corporate entities and lobbyists and interests, private interests in this whole militarily industrially complex situation that we find ourselves in. Okay, so what's happening right now, it would appear, is that NATO is trying to bide its time. It's trying to use Ukraine as much as it can, whilst hoping that Russia doesn't make the connection and eventually start targeting NATO targets. But what they're going to realize is that it is a show of weakness on NATO's part for them to not to formally welcome Ukraine urgently, because what they're doing is they're just playing this game, and the Russians see exactly what they're doing. They're trying to pretend that Ukraine's not a member of NATO whilst getting all the benefits of Ukraine being a member of NATO. Eventually, Russia is going to see through this, and it's going to materialize. It is going to manifest as an attack on some NATO country. Because what NATO is saying in its weakness in order to commit to Ukraine is that we are worried about having to invoke Article 5 against the Russians. Well, why would you be worried? Well, you'd be worried probably because you thought you were going to lose. So what they're saying in not committing to Ukraine fully is that, well, we're scared to invoke Article 5. We're truly scared to do it. So Russia views that as a weakness. So Russia might just say to themselves, if they're scared to invoke Article 5 with Ukraine being integrated into NATO, maybe if we attack one of their military centers or one of their supply lines or one of their, whatever we need to do to minimize their involvement in this conflict, maybe they're not really going to invoke Article 5 either. Okay? Remember how David Petraeus says that we would wipe out Russia's military conventionally if they decided to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Well, how exactly would we ever do that? We simply don't have the capability to immediately do that. Certainly not on a whim. Certainly not with a force of 30,000 that is at the ready. Now, again, this dialectic is likely just for public consumption. What is really going on behind the scenes is, and even this whole temper tantrum that Zelensky apparently threw today where he was upset, it all just seems scripted in the sense that even if it isn't scripted, it doesn't matter. Because the real question is not whether or not Ukraine will be integrated into NATO. Ukraine is already integrated into NATO. They wouldn't be building $100 million weapons factories in Ukraine. I mean, they're already building them. The cluster bombs are already falling. The F-16 training is already happening. We would be delusional to think that it was ever a question of whether Ukraine was going to be integrated into NATO. Of course it is. It already is a part of NATO in every possible way. It's more NATO than NATO. They've received more NATO weapons and support than some countries within NATO's GDP. So it's ludicrous to presume that we even need this formal ratification into the alliance. So this inaugural Ukrainian council that's about to convene tomorrow, what we're probably going to hear about is some measure of security guarantees. And they appear to be priming the acceptance of piecemeal integration into NATO. This is what the former NATO chair Rasmussen was recently talking about, and I brought this up recently where what they were likely going to do would be to say everything west of a certain line of longitude would be considered Ukraine NATO, and thus covered under the Article 5 clause, or whatever you want to call article. And that means that if Russia were to encroach further into that territory, then NATO would be obligated to act. What we are seeing today is that we are already seeing the use of cluster munitions according to the Russians now. This is according to the Russians. Take this one with a grain of salt, because they're not entirely truthful in their reporting of these things either. But what they're saying is that they use cluster munitions in a civilian area in a place called Tokmak, which is in the pathway to Crimea, from where the Ukrainians are primarily based out of in Zaporozhye. Okay, so if this is true, and if we're going to start using these long-range missiles that are now provided by France, if we're going to get ATACMS, which is very likely, and they have to do this stepwise, they have to do it piecemeal to acclimate the Russians to a new level of NATO involvement in the conflict, because they don't want to shock, they don't want to provoke the Russians into taking action against NATO and calling their bluff, because it's going to become abundantly clear to the Russians now that NATO is bluffing. This is a good thing when it comes to the prospect of nuclear Armageddon, because what it says is that NATO is too scared. I think both sides are very scared of having to utilize nuclear weapons. NATO is very scared of having to ever invoke Article 5, because it would, of course, show that maybe NATO is a paper tiger, at least in its current form. And I'm talking about NATO now as a collective alliance and their military capability, not the independent militaries of any given country. Yes, they have very sophisticated military equipment that is in some ways more technologically sophisticated than what Russia has. However, it's perhaps not as durable and not as tried and tested, certainly not as tried and tested in a high-intensity conflict. But as I said yesterday, none of those countries are going to be willing to concede their best equipment. Even the United States is being incredibly stingy. They are the ones who are the most powerful military in the world far and away, and they're the most stingiest with respect to the weapons that they're actually giving Ukraine. Now, there's a variety of reasons to why I've speculated that they don't want Ukraine to necessarily get too strong, and this is a Machiavellian play where you try to keep the guy you have fighting on your behalf at a certain level of manageable weakness so that you can still control him, but not necessarily give him so much power that he has too many options and too many chips to wager with. So this is what I think is happening right now, guys. I do believe that NATO is really terrified of going to nuclear war with Russia. They're doing whatever they can to postpone that. But in their concession, and this is the most important part, and I should have talked about this in the first part of the video, they've basically scrapped the membership action plan. And this is the most important critical step to becoming a NATO member. What they've effectively done, and it's important to remember too, that when they're saying that all these steps must be fulfilled and all these boxes must be checked, it's totally ambiguous. The only thing that needs to happen is that all 32 member states now, with if you include Sweden, if we get there, all they have to do is agree. This criteria, it's open to interpretation. All they're doing now is they're playing the whole strategic ambiguity card. It doesn't matter. What matters now really is that they've scrapped. If you're one of these people who's hung up on this issue of why don't they integrate Ukraine into NATO, well, they effectively have by getting rid of the membership action plan, okay? And no membership action plan, basically what that means, okay, this is what it means, is a willingness to settle international, ethnic, or external territorial disputes by peaceful means, a commitment to the rule of law and human rights, and a democratic control of their armed forces. Ukraine has all those things. They have a willingness to settle international, ethnic, and external territorial disputes. And remember, the rule is that they can't be in a state of war. Well, Ukraine hasn't declared war. Russia hasn't declared war. They call it a special military operation. This is very important to understand. Russia has not declared war, and neither has Ukraine. So, according to NATO's own standards, they could, in some way, shape, or form, if they truly wanted to, they could interpret Ukraine as being ready. Now, we all know there's a lot of corruption. We all know that it's not truly democratic, especially when you're in a state of martial law and you're putting guys in vans who don't want to go fight on the front line and you're sending them against their will to the meat grinder. We know that this is totally subjective, okay? That this is not a hard and fast thing that, oh, we have to do this in order for this to happen. Even Article 5 in of itself doesn't necessitate all of the countries immediately come to aid. It doesn't mean that we go to nuclear Armageddon with Russia just because Lithuania was struck by a Russian missile. It's not a cut and dry, you know, this follows this type scenario. It is totally open to interpretation. So as long as Ukraine upholds democracy as we view it, again, totally ambiguous legalese, including tolerance for diversity, well, we know Ukraine has done their part to do that, be progressing towards a market economy, be progressing towards that. Doesn't mean you have to be a market economy, but you have to be progressing towards that, have their military forces under firm civilian control, which they have, be good neighbors and respect the sovereignty of other nations. They can easily make an argument that they've been doing that, and work toward the interoperability with NATO forces, something that they are leaps and bounds, arguably, ahead of any other member of NATO. Okay? So this is just, it starts to really look like this is all just a smokescreen. And the terrifying thing is that the Russians know this. The Russians, you don't hear them boasting about how, haha, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, because they know what is really going on here. How could they not realize what is going on here? NATO is getting milk from the cow, but they're not going to buy the cow. They're not going to take on the kind of risk that comes with immediately putting themselves in the nuclear crosshairs by having to invoke Article 5 because somebody shot a missile into Ukraine within 1 minute of them signing any sort of agreement. So we're going to find out tomorrow what exactly security guarantees mean. You're not building multi-million-dollar weapons factories in Ukraine without security guarantees. All this talk about how we're going to rebuild Ukraine, and look, Russia's defenses are incredibly thick without some significant counteroffensive advance. There is no way, shape, in hell that they are getting through those defensive lines unless they cross the river in some 4D chess move. There just simply is no way they can do it at this point in time unless they really start to beat them down with long-range weapon systems, and they just start leveling the place with cluster munitions. That's really the only way they're going to be making advances. And if that's what they're proposing, then welcome to hell. Because what that means is that they are truly going to risk going to nuclear war with Russia over a few annexed territories that, as we know, happen to lie in one of the most resource-rich regions of the planet, to the tune of $13 trillion worth of natural materials, not counting the renewable potential of that area in terms of the agricultural land. So it's looking like these guys are, they're delusional, they've lost their mind, they're going to take us to the brink of nuclear Armageddon and just keep on prepping, okay? According to the Czech President Peter Pavel, our response to Putin's nuclear threat should be, we all have nuclear weapons and they are all on alert. We also learned today, Prigozhin made a video appearance and he said that they're going to be training troops in Belarus. So the whole thing about the camps, it's all true. They're going to go to Belarus to train the Belarusians. Now, where we've went wrong with our assessment of this war, and I do want to apologize because it's very easy for us to get caught up in the imminence of the threat and for us to overstate the imminence of the threat. Make no mistake, every day that has gone by for the past 18 months, we've been on an incremental march to war with Russia, a march towards World War III. Our problem is that we're always assuming that these things are going to happen faster than they do. It's in slow motion. You know, you get the nukes in Belarus. Now you have the NATO commitment to expand the combat readiness force beyond 300,000 now they're talking. Okay, they're talking about giving Ukraine security guarantees. Being a member of NATO was never even on the table a year ago. It would be unthinkable because this is, of course, the primary reason why we went to war with Russia in the first place, through the NATO proxy. So my friends, while it is progressing slower than expected, don't get all excited and say, oh, nothing's happening, oh, see? Because use that as an opportunity to take the time that you need to get squared away, because it appears as though that for whatever reason, whether it is pride, whether it is strictly for financial purposes, or whether it's just a imperialist war for territory, obviously all wars are resource wars when it boils down to it at the end of the day. And if that's what this is truly about, if this is truly just ultimately about the West trying to get Europe on lock before they go to war with the Chinese, or whatever sort of resource war is in the cards, then we need to keep on preparing, and we need to use every bit of time that we can just to get everything squared away to the best of our capability. Now, what is my prospect or my estimate for the fear, uncertainty, and doubt meter? How close are we to nuclear war after the events that have been decided today? Well, we're definitely closer than we were yesterday. The only thing that makes me more optimistic is that I do believe it is a sign of weakness. It is a sign that even if Russia were to attack NATO, NATO is too chicken. They're too chicken to immediately escalate things to the nuclear conflict. That's the message that they're sending. Okay, now that is a good thing. It's not good in terms of Russia pushing the conventional military boundaries. They'll continue to push on if they think we are weak. There's no doubt about that. Why wouldn't they? I mean, at this point in time, there is going to be no prospect for peace because the goal is demilitarization. And so long as Western Ukraine continues to militarize, and so long as NATO continues to militarize them, there never is going to be any lasting peace in that region. And right now, NATO doesn't have to answer to its population. It doesn't have to have coffins coming home. Look, it's better to have commas exiting your bank account as far as they're concerned than body bags coming home for the cameras. That's NATO's primary concern right now, is to try to utilize, and I know this sounds incredibly harsh, but that appears to be what it is, use as many Ukrainian lives as they can before they have to dig into their own human resource coffers, so to speak. All right. So all that means is that the war is going to continue to escalate. They've given the Russians no incentive to discontinue their conventional war, because the Russians know that if and when the war ever stops, Ukraine is going to be accepted into NATO, even if it's a rump state. Maybe the Russians don't want to go for that, because from that rump state that remains, maybe then that's when Ukraine starts shooting more missiles at the Russians. Now, one final thing for you to think about, and it's very unfortunate that Ukraine is being exploited in the way that it is, because what may be happening, and what maybe the only possible outcome for this, is that whatever is left of Ukraine is just integrated into surrounding countries, and there is no Ukraine left. And that this was all just a ploy to exploit the Ukrainians, to try to bankrupt the Russians, as much as they could, weaken the Russians, possibly cause civil unrest, and create Russia's downfall so that China could not rely on them for energy moving forward in the future. It appears as though that the plan is to exploit Ukraine for everything, for resources, for manpower, and it's incredibly sad to see, because I know there's probably a lot of Ukrainians, and I'm not saying this is the case, I'm just floating this as idea. A lot of people think, or Ukrainians are thinking, that NATO is supporting their nationalist cause. But understand that money talks, man. They're never going to do anything for moral or ethical reasons. We never go to war because, you know, people are treating people badly. That's never, if that's been the case, we would be in a lot more wars around the world right now. So clearly there is a profit motive. They are looking out for their own interests. I was going to say our own interests, because obviously we are culpable in this. If we are the ones benefiting from the US being solidified as the global reserve currency because we can keep countries like Russia down and we can keep countries like China contained, then we are the ones who are benefiting in some way, shape, or form from the bloodshed happening over there. All the more reason to advocate for peace wherever possible. Isn't it funny that the people who advocate for peace, those are the ones who get canceled, it seems. And we've always been an advocate for the most peaceful resolution of this conflict. But unfortunately, the people who are saying, no, you can't become members of NATO until the war is over, are the ones who are not advocating for peace. They're calling for more war. They're calling for more counteroffensive. Okay, they're wanting Ukraine to get its land back, which seems like a preposterous proposition at this point. It seems like an impossibility. Not saying it's not. The Ukrainian generals claim that we can do it. We just need a bit more stuff and we're going to do it. We're going to make a breakthrough. And hey, it very well may be the case. A lot of these former military and former colonels and intelligence officers have been wrong about an awful lot. They've been saying that Ukraine is finished for months and months and years, and sometimes I even wonder if these people are just paid disinfo agents. If not paid disinfo agents, maybe like double agents or something like that, because it appears as though Ukraine is not, you know, I mean, they're not folding in the way that everybody thought they would fold. And you can only use that copium argument for so long, that Russia is holding back because they don't want to lay waste to the cities. You can only use that for so long until it fails to carry any kind of weight. Now, I've given you guys a lot of things to think about. I don't say anything definitive on this channel, but what we do know that's definitive is that the membership action plan has been scrapped, which is the most critical hurdle for any country entering NATO. Okay, so they're already a de facto member of NATO. Russia knows it. Now the ball is in Russia's court. Is Russia going to start attacking decision-making centers within NATO countries? And what is NATO going to do about it? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care, Canadian Prepper.